Hello, I'm Dr. Don Teague, the creator of the Alpha Zone, and I'm really thrilled to have with me today one of our A-team coaches here at the Alpha Zone, our pitching coach, specifically Jim Curnal. Jim is a really interesting story in that he was headed towards an incredibly great pitching career with the New York Yankees, but unfortunately, like we're hearing so often today, he developed arm trouble, and that was the end of that career. He moved on to being a corporate executive, but it was always his passion to come up with the real reasons why pitchers were failing as much as they are today. And this has been his sort of life work. So, Jim, I'd like you to fill us in more about your background, and I have a bunch of questions I'd like to pose for you to get to the bottom of all this. So, without further ado, take it away.
Great, thanks, Don. Just a quick 30-second bio. As Don mentioned, I pitched in the New York Yankee organization. Started really successfully. I started 14-3, single A, double A, and triple A. Threw in the low 90s, was clocked at 94, so I had a little bit of gas. Woke up one morning, I couldn't lift my arm off the pillow. Went through a series of rehab, which was not successful. So I moved on to the business world. And from there, I became a stay-at-home dad for about 10 to 12 years. Then transferred into and moved into coaching. And I wound up coaching high school sports for 12 years. I coached basketball, baseball, and football at several local high schools in the area.
Well, that's a good background. Now we're going to get to the hard questions. Are you ready?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. In your opinion, what is the number one problem with the current approach to developing young pitchers?
No doubt about it. It's velocity. I see it. I hear it. I read it. I ran into a father a while back, and I asked how his 17-year-old son was doing. He was at a showcase in Georgia, and he said, "Great, through 88." So I asked him, "How's his changeup?" And he goes, "He doesn't have one." So I go to myself, that pretty much ended that conversation. Every MLB telecast, it's miles per hour, 98, 99, 100. That's all youth pitchers see. That's all you hear. One major facility, on their website page, homepage, had the question, "Do you know what's holding you back from throwing harder?" Well, my website would ask, "Do you know why you can't throw strikes?" And I followed up by, "Can't throw a changeup? We'll teach you." The sad part is that this search for the holy grail of velocity has kind of turned the pitching paradigm on its head.
All right. Be more specific about what you mean by that. Turned the pitching paradigm upside down on its head.
Well, the four tenets of pitching in this order are command, number two, change of speed, number three, movement, and finally, velocity. If you can't command the strike zone, ahead behind the count, if you can't change speeds to impact the hitter's timing, which is critical. And number three, if your ball has no movement, it does not matter how hard you throw. And this applies to a 17-year-old who throws 85 or a 27-year-old who throws 95. Youth pitchers today are being sold about velocity, on velocity. They're being told they need to throw weighted balls. They're being told they need to throw the baseball 100 yards on the football field, which equates to 90 miles an hour. The unfortunate part of that is that in my 12 years of coaching, I've probably seen and evaluated hundreds of pitchers. I can count on one hand those who I feel had a fundamentally sound throwing motion. So now you take these four throwing motions and you throw a weighted ball or try to chuck a baseball 100 yards, you're only increasing the risk of arm injuries for youth pitchers.
Wow, that's so interesting. You've already gotten on the subject of your devotion and commitment to this whole situation. Let's talk a little bit more about how you got inspired, what got you on this path to come up with a more effective, efficient approach to developing throwing motion.
Sure. Like in any experience in life, the longer you do something, you learn, and you experience different situations, and you learn from that. So as I was beginning to teach athletes, and I taught athletes in all three sports, I began to realize I was teaching them to move athletically, to create and maximize energy from the ground up, to maximize their performance and decrease their risk of arm injury. I mean, risk injury, whether it's a football player or a basketball player. I realized I was teaching pitchers how to throw the baseball athletically. And as I began to work with them, I began to see some common flaws. And I saw that these common flaws were impacting their lower half ball timing, which was adversely impacting their health and also impacting their ability to command the strike zone and actually to improve their movement and their performance on the mound.
Well, let's go right there. You described something called lower half ball timing. Be more specific. Tell me about
Sure.
that.
Let me just put up a photo, and I think it'd be easy to explain this way. So here you have Baker Mayfield and Jake DeGrom. I could have picked any one of 30 MLB quarterbacks and any one of hundreds of pitchers. I chose DeGrom because he's had shoulder, elbow, and lat injuries this past year. So if you look at photos 1 and 5, they look pretty much the same, but it's about how they get there. 2 through 4 for Baker Mayfield, you can see as he rotates his lower half, he uses that energy to deliver his ball from number 2 in early cocking to number 5 in release. Conversely, as Jake DeGrom starts to rotate his hips, his arm starts to collapse. And what he does is create a weak upper front side. As you can see, his shoulder and glove are pointing at elbow or pointing to first base, which puts tremendous stress on his shoulder and his beginning to create stress on his lat. If you look at number 4, where this hip's fully rotated, his arm is collapsed behind his head, parallel to the ground with his palm up. That baseball has to travel 180 degrees to release without any lower half energy at all because his hips are fully rotated. To me, Jake DeGrom has simply created a slingshot for his arm and created poor lower half ball timing. Baker Mayfield has created optimal lower half ball timing. No different than the next slide where you have Djokovic and you have Dustin Johnson who have to create maximum power from the lower half with optimal timing for Djokovic to serve a tennis ball 135 miles an hour and Dustin Johnson to drive a golf ball 340 yards. No different than the next slide where you can see every athlete who either throws or hits a ball or throws an object is creating maximum energy from the ground up with optimal timing. And I think you can see that really well with Mike Trout and Tiger Woods.
Great. Let's get into this research that you've been undertaking for the last several years and where it's headed. How did it begin, and what are you actually finding from your research?
Well, I began to see some common flaws in youth pitchers and major league pitchers as I began to study this more. So I kind of had a little cottage industry, and 3 or 4 years ago, I started writing teams. Pitches about pitchers I thought I actually knew were going to get injured because I've had it through the baseball. So I wrote the Yankees about Severino and Montgomery. I wrote the Mets about Syndergaard. I wrote the Dodgers about Buehler and May. I wrote the Red Sox about Sale. I wrote the White Sox about Kopech. And I sent them letters and said, here's the motion breakdown. Here's where I think there's going to be some issues. If there aren't adjustments that are going to be made, they're going to have a serious injury. And unfortunately, 6 months to a year later, they all had Tommy John surgery.
Wow. Interesting. How about talking a little bit more about your research and getting into more specific examples?
Right. So this got me a little more involved, especially when COVID hit, because I had a lot of downtime. So the first research I did was that I looked at the top 2021 MLB pitching prospects. There were 227 in total. 85% have been injured at this time. And if you look at this photo, this is just an example of what they look like. And their throwing motions are absolutely horrendous.
Very interesting.
Next research project I undertook was I wanted to look at youth pitchers, minor league pitchers, because I started seeing minor league pitchers written about having Tommy John surgery. So I researched all the #1 draft picks between 2017 and 2021 who were pitchers. Between 2017 and 2018, 1 in 3 have had Tommy John surgery. There were $61 million spent on these draft picks. Between 2017 and 19, 60% of these #1 draft picks have been injured. And I would venture to say that if the 2020 season was not canceled because of COVID, those numbers would even be higher. I next I started evaluating pitchers with Tommy John surgery. And I looked at over 100 pitchers who've had Tommy John surgery to evaluate their motions. They all look the same. I had a former MLB pitcher who I shared this with, and his response to me was, well, there's no cookie cutter approach to pitching. There's not one size fits all. And if you look at the next photo that comes up, I would tend to disagree, because to me, they're all throwing exactly the same, plus or minus some varying degrees.
Very interesting.
Talking about Tommy John surgery, if you look at the next photo, I began to see, as I talked about, a really common denominator. And what I was kind of amazed at was that MLB medical staffs and coaching staffs and even pitchers didn't think this arm path and timing had an adverse arm impact on arm injury. And it was really evident to me that this was the case by looking at the next photo. Because if you look at Noah Syndergaard, this was him prior to Tommy John surgery on the left, and this is him after his first rehab start. He has made no adjustments at all in his throwing motion.
I was just going to say, really no different whatsoever.
Right, and the common viewpoint or common view is that Noah got injured because he throws 98, he throws a slider. I firmly believe that Syndergaard was injured and incurred an arm injury because of how he threw 98 and how he threw a slider. My favorite picture, or my favorite photo of all is the next photo, is Tyler Glasnow. This is a photo of his first start after rehab. His arm is past parallel, the ball is outside of his head, and his upper body is tilted 45%, 50%. 45 degrees. He is the 8th pitcher in the last couple of years in the Rays organization to have Tommy John surgery. So it's difficult for me to understand how major league medical staffs, coaching staffs, and even pitchers themselves feel that this is the most efficient and effective way and healthy way to throw the baseball 98 miles an hour, I'm sorry. Chris Bassett, to me, though, was a very interesting study. If you look at this next photo, he's actually one pitcher in an article I read said that this is the reason, his throwing motion was the reason why he had an injury and needed Tommy John surgery. He said his motion was horrendous and he needed to make some adjustments. Well, as you can see by these photos, prior to and after Tommy John surgery, he hasn't made any adjustments at all. But be honest with you, at this juncture, that would not be my concern. You can take this photo down for a second. My concern, if I was the Blue Jays or Chris Bassett, would be his right shoulder. Put the photo back up and I'll show you why. He has absolutely no front side. His front side is extremely weak and open. His glove is all the way down to the ground, which puts a tremendous amount of strain on his right shoulder coming through. So for me, it's not a question of if, it's really a question of when Chris Bassett's going to have a significant and serious shoulder injury.
You know, not to be using a pun, but as an eye doctor, this is really eye-opening information. I have to say it. And I'm really excited about you being one of our coaches, because I think these young pitchers out there will have a lot to learn from you. Let me say that.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I've used all this research to understand, and I've seen that there's a correlation between how youth pitchers and major league pitchers throw, regardless of whether you're 17 or 28 or 35. They're all throwing the same way. Okay. And my concern is not how major league pitchers who are making millions of dollars throwing the baseball. My concern is how youth pitchers are being taught. And if you show the next screen, I'll speak to exactly what I'm talking about. These are just a sample of the photos of the hundreds of pitchers that I've worked with and evaluated. And I always take a video before I start working with them. Same lower half same poor lower half ball timing, same lack of balance and stability, and same arm path collapsed behind the head with hips fully rotated. You can take this down. So this is what they see. This is what they were taught. And they say imitation is the greatest form of flattery. My concern is that in this situation, imitation is the surest path to an arm injury, which is very unfortunate, and which is why I've gotten so involved working with youth pitchers. In addition, one more thing to that, I talked about performance issues as a result of a poor throwing motion. Well, I did a research study. The final one I did was I looked at starters in June and July this past year. There were 1,600 starters. Okay. The average was 5 innings and they threw 89 pitches. 19% of them threw 100 pitches, 5 innings or less. 18% had a strike ratio less than 60%. 35% had a strike ratio less than 64%. Okay, so what I've seen on the youth level or high school level, I've really seen on the major league level. So, when I look at these numbers, I go, they're not going to the bullpen because they're choosing to. They're going to the bullpen because they have to go to the bullpen.
Let me tell you, Jim, this is such great stuff. And I can't wait to get people to take your course and learn exactly the right way to throw a pitch. So again, Jim Curnal, one of our Alpha Zone coaches in the area of baseball and pitching. Make sure you sign up with him. And Jim, I can't thank you enough. Today was great. I think you explained so much of what we really need to know. And I want to wish you an incredibly great day, and looking forward to working with you.
Sure. And before we end, let me just ask you with one quick thing, right? I'm just going to read you one testimonial from one of the many pitchers I've worked with, which is I think is important. This is from a college pitcher who I worked with this past summer, and he is a D1 pitcher, conference pitcher of the year. And I worked with him this summer, two sessions, and then I worked with him. I had 2 video lessons that I gave him in the fall. This is what he said to me. I'll read you his quote. The adjustments I made in my throwing motion have helped me to improve my lower half ball timing. I was able to create more balance and stability through my throwing motion, which enabled me to use my lower half more effectively. I noticed the following results. 1, my command has improved. My strike ratio has gone up. My pitches are moving crisper. I now feel I can throw any pitch in any count. Number 2, my arm wasn't nearly as sore as it used to be when I finished pitching. My arm recovered much quicker and was ready to go earlier than before. Number 3, after making the adjustments, my throwing motion feels smoother and I am throwing harder. I will leave you all youth pitchers, with this, which I firmly believe. It's not how hard you throw. It's not what you throw. It's not how much you throw. My research and my experience, I feel it's firmly about, it starts with the foundation, how you throw.
Excellent advice. On that note, thank you to everyone for watching. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you.